Welcome to the CAUV webinar hosted by Ohio Farm Bureau. I'm Ty Higgins. Current agricultural use value has increased substantially following the 2023 reappraisal and update affecting 41 counties that have seen new tax bills this year. Some counties have reported CAUV increases of 80 to 100%. Why are values increasing and how do property taxes respond? That's why we are here and why you are here to discuss the recent increases in CAUV values, share information to help you understand the property tax system, and get an update on legislative action being taken on that front. This webinar will last just about an hour. It is being recorded and it'll be shared through membership channels afterwards. If you happen to miss something during the webinar or get in halfway through, no problem. We will get you caught up through our channels later on this week. There is a chat feature to this as we talk about CAUV. You can drop those questions in the chat room. We will go over those towards the end of the webinar once we get through the presentation this hour. This is just one of the ways that we serve our members with educational webinars like this. You can also find out how we protect members from regulation, legislation, litigation that might be harmful to their way of life, and not to mention the resources we offer to give our members the most competitive advantage they have for their best farm future. You can find out more about it, and if you're not a member, you can get signed up by contacting your County Farm Bureau office or, of course, online at ohiofarmbureau.org. You talk about an expert in this matter, everyone knows one name. That is Leah Curtis. She is our policy counsel with Ohio Farm Bureau. Our members call her about CAUV. Lawmakers call her about CAUV. County auditors call her about CAUV. She is our expert on staff, and she's the one going to be visiting with us today about CAUV. Leah, great to see you, and thank you for taking time to do this for our members.
Thank you. We're glad to be here and looking forward to working through all this information with our members today.
Yeah, you have a great presentation coming up. Before we get to that, though, why are CAUV values increasing?
So the main reason that CAV values are increasing is because of a strong farm economy. So CAV is designed to follow the farm economy. It uses about 7 years worth of data. And so what we've seen over the last 7 years is fairly strong and healthy farm economy, and our CAV values are responding to that. But we'll explain all of the details of that as we go through this morning, and how that calculation works and how that's impacting the values.
I'm going to monitor the chat room here while you do your presentation, but take it away.
All right, thank you, Ty. So, welcome everyone. As Ty said, I am Policy Counsel and Senior Director of Member Engagement for the Ohio Farm Bureau. And today we are going to talk about CAUV and property taxes. So, just a little bit of an agenda so you know where we're headed. We're going to talk about the basics of Ohio's property tax system. Then we'll talk about the CAV calculation. And then last, we'll talk about what's happened with CAV values this year in 2023, and kind of how that's impacting and what we are working on. So, to start with, for your property tax system, I like to start with the fact that there are two constitutional requirements for our property tax system. First is that your property will be valued at its true value in money. And generally, we think of this as the highest and best use or the market value, the value that it would change hands between a willing seller and a willing buyer. The one exception to that true value requirement is the current ag use valuation program that we're going to talk about today. And that was achieved through an amendment to the Ohio Constitution. The second requirement is that all property tax rules and laws be uniform in rule. So essentially, what we do to one type of property, we should be treating all other properties the same. The one exception to that is another constitutional amendment that allowed for two classes of property. Class one, which is residential and agricultural property, and then class two, which is all other property in the property tax system. And this largely is important for the application of the tax reduction factor, which we're going to talk about in a few minutes. When is your property value figured is also important. So every 6 years, your property goes through a reappraisal. That reappraisal is a mass appraisal of all the properties in your county, and it determines what those market values are. Every 3 years after that, there's what we call a triennial update. That triennial update is mostly looking at the recent sales on paper, and so sometimes it's called a paper update, and that also updates your market values. If you're on the CAUV program, your CAUV value is also going to change at each of those points, and you will have the newest calculation with the newest data applied to your property. This map shows when reappraisals and updates are happening across the state. You can see those counties in yellow had a reappraisal and update in 2023, and that means they saw new tax bills in January 2024. We always pay our taxes 1 year behind. So when you see that year, that's the year of your reappraisal. The new tax bill comes in the next January. So our counties in blue, their counties are currently performing those reappraisals and updates, and they will see a new tax bill in January 2025. Next important thing to know is the assessment value. So while you will have a total value for your property, in Ohio, our taxes are assessed on 35% of that value. And there's essentially four parts of your property's value. There's the value of your home, the value of your home site, the value of any other buildings on the property, and then last, your agricultural land. Agricultural land is the only part that gets valued for CAUV. Your buildings, your home, and your home site, which is the 1 acre around your home, those are going to be valued at market value. And when you combine those together, that gets your total value of property. That total value is reduced to 35%, and that's what is called your taxable value. So if you look at your tax card online, or maybe you've had something sent to you from the auditor and it has an appraised value and a taxable value, that's why you have those two different values. The taxable value is what your millage rate is actually applied to. So what is millage? Well, those are our property tax rates. We're a little more familiar with property taxes or other taxes to be presented as percentages, like sales tax is 7% or 7.5%. But for property tax, we express those rates in millage. And 1 mil equals 1/1000th of a dollar, or 10 mils equals 1%. So for example, 5 mils would be 0.005 cents or about 0.5%. Your millage rate is a combination of both unvoted and voted millage. The first 10 mils of your tax bill are what we call inside millage. Those are required by the Ohio Constitution, and so they're always going to be on your tax bill. After that, most of your millage has likely been voted on by you and the others in your taxing district. So when you see a millage rate, for example, of 40 mils, those first 10 are part of the inside millage. The rest is millage that you voted on. Your millage rate depends a lot on where you live and on which taxing district you are in. And we have a lot of taxing districts across the state. Our millage rates across the state range from a low of around 30 mils to up above 220 mils as the actual gross millage rate that has been voted upon. So depending on where you live, you will have a different millage rate from maybe your neighbors or other people you know in your county. Sort of the last part of your property tax bill, unfortunately, is the most complicated part, and that's what we call the House Bill 920 effect. House Bill 920 was put in place in the 1970s, and the intent of it was to put a control on how much money would be raised from property taxes and to prevent windfalls when there were inflationary increases in property values. So, what it does is it limits the money raised from a levy to what was originally raised in the first year. What I like to say sometimes is when you are voting on a millage rate, you're also voting on how much money is going to be raised from that. And that is the same amount of money that's going to be raised every year that that levy is on your tax bill. And so the way that that is accomplished is that you have two separate millage rates. The gross millage rate, which is the higher millage rates, the rate that you've actually voted on, and then you have the effective millage rate. The effective millage rate is the rolled back millage after that House Bill 920 effect is applied. So essentially what happens in your county is they're going to look at what is the voted millage and how much money needs to be raised, and they'll calculate a tax reduction factor to ensure that they reduce that millage down and only collect the same amount of money that was raised in the first year. So for example, if the gross millage was 100 mils to raise $10 million, and the actual property value of 100 mils would raise $20 million, they'd roll back that millage to 50 mils so that 10 million was still only collected. Those are really big numbers, and that's just for a example purpose, but just to show you that that's how that millage rate works. It would roll back the millage to make sure that the same amount of money was collected in the first year. There is one big exception to that 920 effect, and that is the 20 mil floor. So schools that have at least 20 mils of funding will not roll below that 20 mils. So while most of our other millage is going to roll back, there are many schools, about half across the state, that are at that 20 mil floor, and their millage rate will not roll below that 20 mils. So that 20 mils will respond to inflation, much like the inside 10 mils do, and they will collect an increase whenever there's a change in property value. So now we're going to move on to talking about CAV specifically. And the current agricultural use valuation program is an incredibly important program for Ohio agriculture. It's also a program that is similarly replicated in most other states across the country. And the point of CAV is to value land for its income producing potential from agricultural use only. So while your house and buildings and other properties in your county that aren't on CAV are going to be valued at their highest and best use and at their market value, land that is on CAV is instead going to be valued using only agricultural factors. The whole intent of CAV is to help preserve farmland and keep it in working agriculture. And so the program does that by removing development pressure from the property's valuation. To get those CAEV values, the Ohio Department of Taxation calculates those values for all 3,500 soil types. So every soil type across the state gets a unique value applied to it for cropland and woodland purposes. Those values are presented to an agriculture advisory committee. It is advisory, so the Department of Tax presents those values and information, and the advisory committee has an opportunity to comment. Ohio Farm Bureau is one of the members that is nominated and appointed to that committee, and we're very proud to have that opportunity to talk with the tax department and provide our comments every year. Lastly, the Department of Tax finalizes those values and provides them to your county auditor. What your county auditor does is looks at the soil types on your individual property and applies those individual soil type values to your property to get you a CAUV value. So where do those values come from? As I said, it's a calculation that is performed for all 3,500 soil types. And it is complicated, but at its basic level, it is a calculation of net income divided by capitalization rate. Our calculation is based on three crops: corn, soybeans, and wheat, the three most prevalent field crops in the state of Ohio. And we use 5 factors. We start with a yield that is unique to the soil type and then updated using a 10-year average of statewide yields. We multiply that by crop prices using 7 years of data. We subtract non-land production costs, which come from the OSU Extension crop enterprise budgets. And then we multiply by a cropping pattern. The cropping pattern is essentially the amount of acres harvested of each of the three crops across the state of Ohio. And then that gets us to an income, so we divide by the capitalization rate. The capitalization rate is made up of a debt rate based on a farm credit mortgage for 25 years and an equity rate based on the 25-year average return to farm equity from USDA. All of these data points are using statewide objective data, largely coming from the National Ag Statistics Service Ohio office, and multi-year averages. So I mentioned the crop prices. We have 7 years of data. We drop out the high and the low and average the remaining 5. At the end of the day, each soil has a unique set of yields, and so those values are unique to each soil type. As I said before, there are 3,500 soil types, and a cropland and woodland value is determined for each of those soil types. In general, under the laws of our program, everything is cropland unless it is in woodland, and woodland is 25% shaded with hardwood species. To get a woodland value, we take that cropland value that's already been calculated and deduct out $1,000 for clearing. And then depending on the drainage capability of that soil, there may also be an additional tile drainage deduction. There's also a minimum value set by the Department of Tax. Cropland has a minimum value of $350 per acre, and woodland has a minimum value of $230 per acre. Any land that's over a 25% slope, though, will also be placed at that $230 per acre minimum value. The last kind of caveat to our calculation is conservation lands. If land is in conservation and certified with the auditor, it can be valued at the minimum value, that $230 per acre. Now, conservation land for purposes of this program would be land that is in a federal conservation program under an agreement with the federal government. So things like CRP or CREP. And then in addition to that, any conservation practices that you may have employed on your property to abate soil erosion. Those private conservation practices, as we call them, do have to be limited to 25% of your total acreage. But those can be things like buffer strips, windbreaks, wetlands, and they will all be put at $230 per acre if they're certified with the auditor. To be certified with the auditor, they will need to provide, if it's a federal program, a copy of the contract, and in both cases, a map so that the auditor knows which areas of your property to reduce the value on. One caveat to this conservation value is that the conservation practice has to remain in place for 3 years. If it is not remaining for 3 years, then there will be recoupment owed, and that recoupment will be calculated by looking at what you paid at that lower minimum value and what you would have paid on a regular CAUV value, and you'll pay that back for the last 3 years. After or last 3 years. If you have kept it for 3 years and you decide to change it after that 3 year mark, then there would not be any recoupment at that point. I want to touch on our CAV reform that we did in 2017. This was actually kind of a process that started in 2014. We were able to make a lot of changes to the calculation, and really it was the first time that this calculation was reviewed since the 1970s. So starting in 2015, we updated the data in the formula so that it would be more timely. So that way, when things changed in the farm economy, we would see those happening quicker in the formula. Previous to that, we had about a 2 year lag in data, and now we have only a 1 year lag, and our costs are up to date. We also got the woodland deductions increased. They were previously much lower. And then we updated the parameters of those interest rates to be consistent with modern lending. Previously, the interest rates were based on 15-year mortgages, and we updated that to that 25-year mark. Then in 2017, we did an additional set of changes that went through legislation. That largely focused on the capitalization rate. The capitalization rate had been based on factors that were not related to agriculture, and that was causing our calculation to not respond to the agricultural economy. So, by taking out those non agricultural factors and making the capitalization rate tied to the ag economy, we got a more accurate formula. We also added in that conservation land value, which we just talked about, so that when you had conservation land, you would not have a penalty from a tax perspective for putting that land into conservation. These resulted in reductions of 30% or more in CAV values and saved hundreds of millions of dollars for farmers, and also ensured that our calculation was much more accurate and more tied to the farm economy. So what has happened with CAV values in 2023? As Ty mentioned, CAV values increased substantially for those in the 2023 reappraisal cycle who just received new tax bills in this past January. And as I mentioned before, this is due largely to strong crop prices over the last several years. As I said, the CAV formula is intended to follow the farm economy. And as we've had a strong farm economy over the last several years, our CAV values are responding accordingly. And while costs have increased, they've not increased at quite the same rate or over the same time frame as the crop prices did. This slide shows you the crop prices that were used in our 2023 formula. As you can see, it's 7 years worth of data. The numbers that have the line through them are the highs and lows that were dropped out. And so more so than we have seen in the past, our crop prices were kind of steadily at one point, at a higher point, and did not move around a lot. And they largely went up from that first year, 2016, until 2022. So having those relatively higher sustained crop prices is largely driving the increases in the CAV formula. This again is that map that I showed you that shows when those reappraisals and updates are happening, so you can kind of know where your county is at in this schedule. Counties in yellow already saw those new values in tax bills. Counties in blue will get new values this year and on their tax bills in January of 2025. We do anticipate there will be increases again in those blue counties as well, because those crop prices are going to still largely be the same in the formula. We'll have 1 new year of crop prices, though we won't know the extent of those value changes until later on this year when the tax department certifies those values. Certainly, as we do get that information, we will be updating our membership so they can be aware of what's happening. So why is this different from those increases that we saw in the 2010 to 2014 range when we did that CAUV formula uh, reform? Those increases were largely being caused by the capitalization rate. And that was because the capitalization rate was focused on non agricultural factors, in large part the prime rate of interest, which does not have a connection to agriculture specifically. And so those increases were being driven largely by what was happening in the broader economy and not the agricultural economy. Today, our increases are largely attributable to those higher crop prices and things that are happening in the ag economy. And as that ag economy has been strong over the last several years, that has resulted in those value increases. So, does CAUV still save money? There's no doubt that CAUV saves property tax dollars for Ohio farmers across the state every year. In 2023, the taxable value of CAUV was about 29% of that same property's market value. So that means when we compare those two values, CAUV value was only about 29% of the actual value that it would be taxed on. While our mid-range soil this year was at $2,340 per acre for value, USDA data currently puts Ohio farmland value at over $8,000 per acre. So comparatively, there is still a lot of savings when it comes to CAUV. This graph just shows you the comparison of the CAUV value to the market value for the last 20 years. So you can see how the CAUV value fluctuates, but our market values tend to increase over time. And so this can just show you a little bit of how that CAUV value continues to save money on our property taxes across the state.
Want to cut in here briefly, Leah, and remind people that the chat is open for questions. We'll take those at the end of the webinar and get to them, and we're getting a couple of good ones here that we'll get to in just a bit. But I have to imagine, with how involved our organization has been in the CAUV process for years, that there are some questions out there about what Ohio Farm Bureau is doing to address these higher CAUV values. What are we doing on that front?
Sure. So we do have Farm Bureau policy as set by our members that supports that our CAV formula be based on objective data. We also have some policy that supports limiting volatility in the formula. So in the past year, we have met with the tax department to discuss these issues and ask them to continually, regularly, and thoroughly review the CAV calculation. There are additional things that we brought up during the CAV reform in 2017 that we've also renewed interest in and asked them to reconsider as well. We know that the spikes in value are the biggest concern, and so we are raising that issue. I would also add that we saw large increases in residential values across the state as well. So there is a lot of attention right now to property tax in general, not just in the ag industry, but also just from regular homeowners as well. And so that resulted in this year's budget bill the legislature did create a joint legislative committee to review Ohio property taxes, and they are reviewing the entire system and all aspects of it. However, they are only taking testimony by invitation. But your Farm Bureau was invited, one of the few organizations that was invited and given a significant amount of time to testify to that committee to make sure that they understand the CAV program. They are definitely in an education and an understanding phase right now, but we wanted to make sure that they understood CAV from all aspects. So we covered how do people enroll in CAV, how do they stay in, what are the benefits of it, and how does the calculation work, so that they could have that big picture to fit into the larger system. We also, through our testimony, highlighted that there are concerns in our industry and from our landowners about volatility and needing predictability within CAV. We know that the increases and the extent of the increases happening at one time is, of course, a huge concern. And we don't see those types of increases in other areas of the property tax system. And then additionally, the inflationary aspects of the property tax system are really causing the largest increases in the tax bill. And so maybe those are things that we should be taking a look at from the broader system. And those inflationary aspects are those first 10 mils of your tax bill, which respond to your property value changes, and then the 20 mils when a school's at the 20 mil floor. Those both respond to property value changes much more sensitively than the rest of your tax bill. And so we brought those up as things that should be reviewed as they move forward through this process.
All right. The chat room has now been enabled. We will start taking those questions as we continue the conversation with Leah Curtis, Policy Counsel with Ohio Farm Bureau. You mentioned you had a chance to testify in front of the Joint Committee for Property Taxes, and it's too early to read the tea leaves, so to speak. But based on some of the questions that you got, what were some of the concerns and some of the questions you got from that panel as they look into the reform for the future?
Yeah, so I think the panel was very interested in particular about the fact of the rate of increase. As I mentioned, and as you mentioned, Ty, we saw values increase 80 to 100%. In residential property and commercial property, we generally don't see increases of that nature during a reappraisal or an update. They may see increases of 30. This year, some saw 40 or 50%, and that's really an outlier. So certainly there was interest to that. I think also they were very interested just in the philosophy and the effect of the program. The program saves Ohio farmland. It keeps Ohio farmers farming. It keeps them providing food and fiber and fuel to not just Ohio but to the rest of this country. And frankly, that's a security issue and a national security issue. If we are able to provide those things for ourselves through our farmland, then we are a safer country.
Another question coming in: how are pastures valued and calculated with CAUV?
Sure. So, pastures in general, as I mentioned before, kind of everything is cropland unless it's woodland. So, for the most part, pasture land is going to receive that cropland value. This is something we have brought up to the tax department as well, and something that we've asked them to consider looking at. However, I will note that in a lot of times, pasture land may have fairly low quality soil types, and so that does impact their value. The soil values will be lower on soils that are lower productivity. And so we often see that in areas that are more suitable and more often used for pasture.
Got a comment here that there's concern for not seeing the formula reflecting fuel increases. Has there ever been talk of that in the past?
So fuel is included in the formula. So that is a cost that is included. It comes from the OSU Extension Crop Enterprise budgets. So they include fuel, oil, and grease as a line item. There's also transportation as a line item as well. So those are included in the cost. Again, as I mentioned before, costs have gone up. They just haven't gone up at quite the extent and in the same time frame as the crop prices. I would guess that as we move into this year's calculation, we will see more impact from cost increases because we're just going to have a different time frame than we had last year in the formula.
We see a lot of county farm bureaus reaching out to the auditors to start conversations with members. How important is that relationship at the county level?
So that is an incredibly important relationship. Your county auditor is the one who maintains this program, enforces this program, and manages it. They are who you have sent your renewal forms to, which should have gone, in the last couple weeks. They are who reviews your enrollment, and then they apply the soil values. I do want to be clear, though, the auditor does not set your CAUV value. So the auditor through their appraisal does set your market value for your house and your other aspects of your property, but your soil value is determined by the calculation as run by the Department of Tax. Um, if you have questions, particularly about your enrollment or maybe the way your property is being categorized, your auditor is that best place to go with those questions. And so having a good relationship and working through that with them is always a great idea.
Are soil maps available to the public online somewhere? Is a question.
Yes. So if you go to the web soil survey from the Natural Resource Conservation Service, you can drill down to your county or even down to your property. I am not sure of what the web address is exactly, but I know if you Google web soil survey, you will get there and you'll be able to look at what the soil maps are. The auditor should also have a list of your soil types so you can talk with them about which soil types they have attributed to your property.
A comment that I will second, complimenting you on your outstanding professionalism and clarity on this very complex topic. Boy, is that ever a statement. This is a topic that very few people know about as much as Leah does. So, I'm very happy to have her on staff here at Ohio Farm Bureau and helping our members through this. How are crop yields by soil calculated?
So the crop yields were recorded for every soil type going back into 1984. That's the last year of those soil specific crop yields that we have. From there, they in the calculation they are updated using a factor, and that factor is calculated by looking at the 10-year statewide average divided by the 1984 statewide average. So they are still, I would say, generally from what I see reported, they are still probably generally a little bit low compared to actual crop yields, but that is how they are based on individual soil types.
How can parcels with no buildings have different rate increases? In this example, the question says one of my parcels went up by 180%, and a field next to the parcel went up 342%.
So that's going to largely be dependent upon your soil types. It's very common that you would have a different slate of soil types between those two parcels. Um, Another thing that can sometimes happen, it's probably not in this situation, but I have talked to many members over the years who have one parcel of land that's in one taxing district and another parcel in another taxing district. So you may also want to check to see if there are different millage rates being applied if those are in different taxing districts. Sometimes it can be as different as one is in a library district and the other one is not in that same library district. It could be an array of different levies that apply to those properties. So I would check into that. And then the other possibility is those soil types. The auditor should be able to help you with the soil maps and which soil types are on which property.
How do they know the different types of soil on my farm, and are there different soil types? Are the different soil types reevaluated?
So I'll start with the second question. The soil types are generally not reevaluated. Soil doesn't tend to change and move. They do periodic updates to kind of check things, but generally the soil types are what the soil types are. There are situations like with mining and things that can change that, and those are outliers, but there are ways to deal with that. The soil types are mapped. Again, that web soil survey is kind of the best resource. And generally, in my experience, most auditors are using that map as their reference point for soil types. If you You can also always talk to NRCS. They can help you with soil maps as well.
We discussed pasture land a couple minutes ago. Do you think pasture land will be broken out as its soil type is considered lower in yield?
So the lower yield is already going to be determined on the soil type basis. Now, if it's a really good soil type and it is in pasture, then that's not going to be reflected in the value because the value is going to reflect the productivity of that soil. As I said, that's something we have commented to the tax department in the past. Whether that is likely, I do not know, but it's certainly something we have asked uh, to keep considering and that we continue to bring up whether there should be some consideration specifically for pasture.
My value seems to be going up more than what you're saying. Why is that?
So we have 3,500 soil types, as I mentioned, and so we are looking kind of at the average when we are talking about the rates of increase, and then we also have a few indicator soils that we look at to try to see what that rate of increase is. Some soils are going to go up more than that, and some soils are going to go up less than that. In particular, we saw a big increase in woodland soils this year, higher than kind of that average increase. I think some of that is attributable to those soils being more commonly being used more for wheat and corn in the productivity data, and so that may have contributed. But we did see those woodland values, some of them go up more significantly than the rest of the values.
Got a couple of comments saying they missed the first half of this presentation. That's all right. Coffee was still brewing. I understand completely. But we are going to have this recording shared through our membership channels later on this week. So you'll see it in Buckeye Farm e-news. You'll see it on our website and our social media channels as well. So this is being recorded. You can go back and watch it whenever time suits you best. Another question here. Can you discuss the difference between commercial and non-commercial woodlands?
Sure. So that's a great question. We didn't talk a lot about qualifying for the program, but one of the ways that you can qualify for the program is with commercial timber. Commercial timber generally is woodlands that you are maintaining for the purpose of commercially harvesting at some point. And so usually those do require a forest management plan with your county auditor, and that just helps them to know that you are maintaining that for commercial use. Um, Additionally, there is a way to qualify land for CAUV as non-commercial timber, and that would be timber that you are not managing that is just, attached to your property. To bring in that non-commercial timber, though, it has to be contiguous to at least 10 acres of something else that qualifies on its own. So, for example, you might have 10 acres of cornfield and you'd have contiguous woodland to it. That contiguous woodland can come in, or 10 acres of pasture with cattle in it and you have contiguous woodland, that contiguous woodland can then come in. But to have non-commercial woodland, it's got to be contiguous to 10 acres of something else that qualifies on its own.
How can providing on farm housing for workers aid farming tax values?
So, any type of structure is going to be valued at its market value. So that is going to increase your taxes because that is going to be a new improvement that will be valued at market value and that you will pay taxes on. So anytime you add a building of any type, whether that be a residence for a farm employee, or a garage, or a new barn, or a new place to park your machinery, that is going to be an improvement that's valued at market value and it's going to have additional taxes will be due and paid on that. Land under buildings that are used for agriculture still can qualify for CAUV, but if it's being used as a residence, it's likely going to be taken out of your CAUV acreage.
How are the peaks and valleys being looked at as most people, especially our farmers, deal with increase that was not detailed to an accurate increase? Why is there not a fail-safe on these increases?
So I'll go back to the constitutional requirements. So there's no limitation on increases for any property value, be it agricultural, residential, or commercial. Um, the kind of limitation that we have in our law is that 920 effect, and it's more on the collection side rather than the value side. So there's kind of two ways you can always get at this: value or collection. And we currently have a limitation on collection. Um, the averaging in the formula is intended, when the formula was created, was intended to try to help with peaks and valleys in the farm economy. But what we saw over that 7 years was not really a peak and valley, but just kind of a peak and going up until that highest amount in 2022. So that is something that we have brought up to the tax department and to the legislature in our testimony. We also talked about the fact that the CAV formula is looking backwards and we're paying taxes today. And so that is sort of the biggest flaw in the system. And really that you could say that applies to residential as well, because we're looking backwards at property sales in that case, and we're paying taxes today. So we have brought that up. We've brought up that concern and whether there is a way that we can address that disconnect. Um, we think we should be continuing to look at that in some way that we can try to address that issue of having that backward looking data, but paying taxes today on it.
There's been an observation in one part of the state that the smaller parcels seem to have had the greatest increase in value. 7, 8 acre parcels more than doubled in value. Does the auditor, the question is, consider these potential building sites and therefore increase the value more?
So no, they do not for a CAUV purpose. So CAUV values are going to look at the soil type, and that is all that is going to control. Now, if you are looking at the market value, that may be the case, and that's going to depend on what recent sales have been in in your local area. And I do just want to remind you that when you get your values, if it doesn't say CAV value and it says market value, that value is interesting and it's pertinent for certain reasons, but it is not the value you are taxed upon. And so the CAV value is going to be the one you are taxed upon and the most pertinent for your taxes. Certainly, market value could be responsive to sizes of lots and amenities to those lots. CAV, however, would not. It would just be looking at soil value.
How do you appeal your CAUV tax?
So appealing CAUV is somewhat difficult because it is not done by your county auditor. You certainly can go through the Board of Revision process. Generally, we do not see CAUV values change through the Board of Revision process, unless there's a situation like they have your property categorized wrong. Maybe they have it as cropland and it should be woodland, or maybe they have the wrong soil type. They have a higher soil type, higher valued soil type than what you have. Otherwise, generally you have to go to the Board of Tax Appeals at the state level, and you have to somewhat question the calculation. You have to appeal the calculation and how it is done. There actually is current litigation going on over CAV values for woodland, particularly. Ohio Farm Bureau has been involved with that case since 2015. We filed an amicus brief in the Supreme Court already once, and now we've filed a second amicus brief as they have returned to the Supreme Court again. So we have been involved with that case since, again, I believe it's 2015, and continue to be in contact with those landowners' attorney and working to support them as we can through our litigation channels.
Getting a couple of forestry questions that I'll put side by side here for you to stay on topic. Is a forestry conservation planning also considered?
I'm not really sure specifically what they mean by forestry conservation planning. So forestry in general is not going to just be conservation for conservation value purposes, if that's what they mean. Um, if you can show that it is 25% or less of your property's acreage and it is those practices that abate soil erosion, like a buffer strip, filter strip, wetland, then it could qualify for that lowest value. Um, if you are talking about a forest management plans can be written through the Conservation Service. They can also be written by private foresters. And generally, they just need to be looking at your forests, telling you what practices need to be done to maintain that for the best possible commercial value of that forest going forward.
What are the options for folks who have their woodland parcels in a conservation easement? Some of these folks see their woods as a conserved woodland and not for commercial timber use. If it understandably doesn't qualify for CAUV, what are their options?
Um, so if it's in a conservation easement, then the auditor should be taking that into account when they determine the market value of that property. If it's in a conservation program with the federal government, then that can still qualify for CAUV. But if it's just a private conservation easement that maybe you've done with a local conservancy, that's not going to necessarily qualify for CAUV. But that easement and the limitations that are on that property should be taken into account by the county auditor. Um, Trying to think if there was something else I wanted to say about conservation easements. Um, if the forest can still be a working forest, then there also may be the option of the Ohio Forest Tax Law. But Ohio Forest Tax Law also requires you to have a working forest. So if there is going to be no harvesting, no commercial use at all, then that probably is going to have to just be a discussion with the auditor about what the appropriate market value is.
I know this is one question the Joint Property Tax Committee has been asked, so I'll ask you as well. Has there been a conversation on updating the soils each year instead of every 3 years so it's not such a huge impact on the property owners?
Yeah, so that's a discussion that we kind of always have. One slight issue with that is that, as I said at the top, we have to treat properties uniform in rule. And so all of the other properties across the state are only updated every 3 years. And so to update ag properties every year, we'd also likely have to either change the constitution, which is difficult, or update every property every year. I'm not going to say that's impossible, but it is quite a lift for your county auditor's offices. Especially smaller offices that might have smaller staff and smaller budgets, that might be more difficult for them to accomplish. But certainly that is something that I think the committee is looking at and looking whether we are using the appropriate time frame for those reappraisals.
Couple of questions about structures on CAUV property. So we'll start with this one. Is there a negative or positive value to having tiny homes on farms as part of agritourism?
So anything like a home that somebody's going to be staying in is not going to qualify for CAUV. So it is going to be taxed at the regular rate or the regular value. And of course, if it's a structure, it's going to be taxed at its market value as well. So as you add things that are not commercial agriculture, so agritourism is a land use, but commercial agriculture is what CAUV looks for. And so as you would remove things for people to stay in particularly, that's likely not going to qualify for CAUV, and so it's likely going to increase the taxes on at least that portion of the property.
If that structure is a portable trailer to live in that's not permanent, is that considered a taxable structure?
So generally, non-permanent structures are not taxed as improvements, but if someone is living in it and if it is there for a significant amount of time in a year, for example, then it may be. And that's going to be a question for your county auditor to talk with. And of course, you can always appeal those things through the Board of Revision for your property. But generally, if someone's living in it and that's kind of the primary use throughout the year, that may harm its CAUV status.
Is there a reduction for ag buildings that aren't being used on the property?
Uh, there's not going to be any specific reduction for a building that's not being used, but the I guess the health of that building and the status of that building may impact its market value. And again, that's something that you can appeal through the Board of Revision with the auditor. If you think the value of an improvement on your property, be it your house or a barn or something else, if you think it's overvalued, that is something you can go through the Board of Revision and appeal. And you can give evidence of why you think that that value should be lower on that structure. Maybe it's falling down, maybe it's not safe to put things in. And then they will consider that accordingly, and they may reduce your value based on that evidence.
This has to do with water sources on the farm. Does the water source of farming operation create a consideration of value of CAUV valuation if the farm has to haul in water if there's no operable well, for instance?
No, so CAV value is only going to look at the soil type and that soil type's characteristics to value it. So the amenities of that property are not going to be considered for the CAUV value. Now, again, the market value might consider that, but the CAUV value that you're taxed on is not going to consider that aspect.
Next question. I have a woodland management plan to qualify for CAUV. That was reevaluated every 10 years. Recently, I received a letter that it was now to be done every 5 years. Could you please explain this change?
So that is going to be a change that is likely unique to your county auditor, and so something that you'll want to talk to your county auditor with. I will say just quickly that county auditors, there's 88 of them, and so that means there's kind of 88 ways of doing things. They are in charge of this program in each county, and so questions specific like that are largely a decision of the county auditor's office, and you may need to speak with them about why they've made that change.
Um, Questions have now all been answered. So if you have additional ones, we have about 13 minutes left, give or take. If you have them, drop them in the chat box. We'll get to them as soon as we possibly can. You mentioned that there are several counties that are being reevaluated as we speak, and I know there's no crystal ball, but what can you say about upcoming valuations for the remaining counties over the next 2 years?
So I think for the counties that are going to be reappraised this year, see new tax bills in January, as I said before, I think there are going to be significant increases in value again for those counties. That's largely based on the fact that the crop prices that we have seen come in from the Ag Statistics Service just in the last week or so are about the same as what's already in the formula, and in some cases higher than the data that's going to be leaving the formula. Now, as I said, we are going to see those input costs probably higher than they were last year in the formula because there have been some more increases. We're not dropping out. When we drop out the high, we'll have kind of 2 years of high prices in the inputs. So that will impact it. But I would expect to see, if you were in one of those blue counties, an increase in values. Now, all that being said, a lot can happen between now and when tax bills come out, particularly for counties in the 2025 reappraisal that won't see new tax bills until 2026. This committee at the legislature is reviewing all aspects of the property tax system. And so there may be changes in the system entirely that will impact what things look like in the future. So I promise if I get a crystal ball, you all will be the first ones to know. I will use it for good, I promise. But that's kind of what we know today with the data and information that we have available to us.
Got a question here. Going back really to the beginning of our conversation, how do I apply for CAUV?
Sure. So you apply to CAV with your auditor. At this point, if you are not in the CAV program, the enrollment window has largely closed for this year. So you may be kind of looking for next year. But to apply, you need to show that you have 10 acres of commercial agricultural production. If you have less than 10 acres, you need to show $2,500 of gross annual income from agricultural production. And you need to show that it's been in that use for 3 years. So if you have land that you bought and it's been in CAUV, you'll probably be able to just renew it. You can use the 3 years from somebody else. If it's land that's never been used for agriculture, you are going to have that 3-year wait period. Um, Once you get through that 3-year wait period, though, then you can enroll. Some auditors will allow you to provide them information during that 3 years so that when you do enroll, they've already got the information. But that's just kind of unique to each county auditor. But you'll need to show those things. You'll apply through a form with the county auditor. If you're new to the program, you'll pay a $25 fee. And then the auditor will review it and determine whether you qualify for enrollment.
Understanding history of crop prices and the overall economy, but looking ahead to increased input costs and crop prices going down, over what period will these values be reviewed and reflected in valuations?
So every year, the years that are used for the calculation change. So we actually do run this calculation every year. It's just you as a taxpayer only see the impact every 3 years when you have that reappraisal or update. So as every year turns, we will add that new data into the formula, and you will see that impact at your next reappraisal or update. So as I said, and that is something we've also brought up in the past, of course, and we talked about it with the every year valuation. Once you get a value, you sit there for 3 years. And so the data that you had your value based upon by that third year is pretty old and not consistent with today's economy. So that is something that we have also brought up, as I mentioned, and we continue to bring up that concern of that kind of historical look back and that present day payment.
Those residents in the 41 counties that are seeing these increases got that tax bill in January. There's a question about where those tax dollars go. Does that depend on the county, or is there a general fund that it goes into?
So kind of generally it's the same across counties. So you have those first 10 mills of your tax bill, which are the inside millage. Usually around 40 to 50% of that is going to go to your school, and then the rest is going to be distributed among your county entities and local government entities as determined by your county budget commission. After that, all of the millage on your tax bill is largely directed to specific areas, and some tax systems online for an auditor will actually show you that. If not, your county auditor may be able to help you with that information. If you are in a school that is at the 20 mil floor, then 20 mils of your tax bill went to them, and you can see that from your millage rate. Typically, the county treasurer has published a list of the tax rates in your local paper. They also should have it available for you, and that usually breaks down your millage rate to kind of say like how much millage went to each part of your tax bill. But generally, it's going to your school, your local governments, your county, your township, or if you live in a city, and then your other local entities, things like the Board of Health, your libraries, your fire district, EMS, those kind of things.
A lot of accolades, thank yous, golf claps coming from the chat room for you taking time to answer these very tough questions. And there's also a comment about where people can stay informed about these types of changes. And I will tell you firsthand that OhioFarmBureau.org is probably the best bet for you to stay up to date on these CAUV values. We have been telling our members about what was going to be happening in January in the middle part of last year, and we'll be doing that again when the new valuations for the next round of counties come out and let our members know exactly what to expect. But where else? What other resources are out there to keep people in the know about this?
So yeah, I would echo you, Ty. I mean, I think not to toot our own horn, but we are going to be your best place to find that information. We are the entity that's going to be reporting that to you as up to date as possible. The tax department's website does also include information about CAV. If you scroll to the bottom, you click Ohio taxes, real property, and then CAV. That gives you information. Generally, that's not updated until they've certified those values, but they will have that information there available. Your county auditor also will typically update you on your property value once those values are certified. That's usually not until the end of the year into the fall or towards the very end of the year around November. Um, but we will be continuing to update you. So through our publications, through our website, we have a podcast that Ty and I do, and we always report on this as well. So we will be continuing to update as that information becomes available.
One final question here before we wrap things up. Are you aware of CAUV being applicable towards urban farmers who may be selling the required minimum?
So CAV does not really care where you're located so long as you meet those requirements. And so um, if you can meet that 10 acres or that income amount, then you can apply for CAV and you can qualify. You do have to have commercial agriculture, though. I do want to stress that because I talk to people sometimes and they say, well, I have a garden and I'm, supplying food for my family. And that is a wonderful thing and a respectful thing, but the CAV law does require it to be a commercial use. So you do want to focus on that. Before we go, Ty, I do want to just mention too this program and its importance, but also how we continuously have to defend this program. So CAV is a program that obviously, as we've seen, does save our farmers a lot of tax money and it helps keep them on the farm farming. But that doesn't mean it's not without criticism. There are groups that do not like CAV. We had an auditor who testified this past year on a bill in the legislature who said that taxes had largely been eliminated on agricultural land, which of course I think all of you would disagree with. And certainly we did. And we brought that up to the tax committee as well, that there are still significant property taxes. Property taxes are a significant expense for farmers, and that's why this is so important. Um, and there are criticisms lobbed at the program repeatedly, and people that would like to see it changed and maybe less of a benefit. So it is something that we have to continuously defend. We have to keep that in mind as an organization, as all of you members, continuing to lift it up to your lawmakers about how important it is really helpful to maintaining this program in the law for all of us.
Really appreciate you, Leah. Thank you for everything you do. Leah Curtis, Policy Counsel for Ohio Farm Bureau, taking the time to take all these questions from our members and non-members. I should mention that there are people that are on this webinar that are not members of Ohio Farm Bureau, and I hope that over these last 55 minutes or so that you've easily seen the value of just what Leah brings to this one topic of conversation with CAUV, not to mention everything else we do as an organization for our members across the state and what Farm Bureau does for farmers across the country as well. Leah did mention the other resources online at ohiofarmbureau.org. Of course, we have the landowner toolkit that is exclusive for Ohio Farm Bureau members. There'll be a recording of this webinar on the website as well. We have an FAQ for CAUV that you can easily access online as well. Legal with Leah podcast, which someone just asked, how can I find your podcast? Really easy, ohiofarmbureau.org, and just search Legal with Leah. You'll find CAUV podcasts as well as many other topics that she and I get into over the course of a year. So all that and a way to sign up to be a member online at ohiofarmbureau.org. Leah, thank you. Thank you, everyone who's joined us on this webinar. Really appreciate your attention and your time. And again, all the resources you need online at ohiofarmbureau.org. Have a great rest of the day. See you down the road.
Thank you.